रब्बि इश्रह ली सदरी व यस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम Assalamu alaikum. Let's start the brief explanation of the 29th para with a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts to the message of the Quran. Ameen. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Mulk, which was revealed in the 4th year of prophethood in Makkah. In this surah, the universal, personal and historical arguments of Tawheed have been given. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 2, Who has created death and life, that he may test you? Which of you is best indeed? This is the purpose of our lives. Why we were created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To test who does the best deeds. Our test has already started. It is an open book test from the Quran and Sunnah. Now our aim is to get the best mark, not average or just pass, but the best marks. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us in verse 3, who created the 7 heavens, one above the other. You will not see any flaw in what the Lord of mercy creates. Look again. Can you see any flaw? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made everything and made everything perfectly. The signs of nature are not just aesthetic wonders, but they are also to help us realize that the power and might of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond what we can understand. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 12, Indeed, those in awe of their Lord without seeing Him will have forgiveness and a mighty reward. No one has seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yet the believers stay away from sins out of His fear. For such people, there is a great reward and they will never go to hell. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us in verse 14, How could He who created not know His own creation? When He is the most subtle and all aware, how is it possible that the creation can hide anything from its creator? He has made every vein, muscle, every bone of our body. We breathe because He enables us to breathe. We move because He enables us to move. He knows what we think and all that we plan. There is nothing hidden from Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 24, Say, it is He who has multiplied you throughout the earth, and to Him you will all be gathered. Surah Al-Qalam. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Qalam, which was revealed in 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is to fear the punishment of this world and the next. The surah starts with speaking of the greatness of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 4, And you are truly a man of outstanding character. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself acknowledges the beautiful character of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His character was the Quran. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, The best among you in Islam are those with the best manners. The person who has good manners gets the blessings of both worlds. And then in verses 10 to 16 gives us the example of a man with the worst manners. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, And do not obey every worthless, habitual swearer, slanderer, gossip-monger, withholder of good, transgressor, evildoer, cruel, moreover an illegitimate pretender, because he is a possessor of wealth and children. When our verses are recited to him, he says, Legends of the former people, we will soon mark his snout. This is the description of an evil man of Makkah. Verses 17 to 32 contain the story of the owners of the garden. They were materialistic and greedy. They planned to pluck their garden at such a time when no poor people would be near, and they would not have to give any fruit to them. When they reached their garden in the morning, they saw that it had been destroyed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They eventually realized their mistake and repented. This makes us realize that when we don't share the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with others, the blessings in our own resources also lessen. Surah Al-Haqqah. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Haqqah, which was revealed in 4th or 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is to believe in the Quran and do good deeds. The surah starts with describing the punishment that came upon the past communities. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the day of judgment and the happiness of the doers of good. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 19, As for those given their records in their right hands, they will cry happily, Here, everyone, read my record. I surely knew I would face my reckoning. They will be in a life of bliss. Can you feel the happiness of that person by reading the verses? Doesn't it make you think of the student who did such hard work and finally gets the report card with the best grades? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among such people. Ameen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 25 to 30, And as for those given their records in their left hands, they will cry bitterly. I wish I had not been given my record, not known anything about my reckoning. I wish death was the end. My wealth has not benefited me. My authority has been stripped from me. This man was a man of authority in the world. On the day of judgment, he will realize that the power of which he was so proud in this world will be of no use there. Surah Al-Ma'arij. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Ma'arij, which was revealed in the 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central theme of this surah is a warning to the disbelievers about the day of judgment and resurrection. The surah starts with speaking of the length of judgment day to be 50,000 years and then describes the terrors of that day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 11 to 14, they will be shown each other. The criminals will wish that they could be ransomed from the punishment of that day by their children and his wife and his brother and his nearest kindred who sheltered him. That day will be so difficult that a person would be willing to exchange his spouse, children, and those people who have done a favor to him in his place of hellfire. Are these not the same people for whom we compromise our religion today? Verses 22 to 35 describe the qualities of the people who will be saved from the hardships of that day. They are the ones who are regular in their prayers, who give from their wealth to those who ask and to those who do not ask, who believe in the day of judgment, who fear the punishment of their Lord, who guard their chastity, who are trustworthy, who honor their promises, who are observant of their prayers. Note that praying properly was the first as well as the last quality. Surah Nuh. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Nuh, which was revealed in the 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is the invitation and propagation of Tawheed and life after death. The surah starts with describing the mission of Hazrat Nuh alayhi salam and his encounter with his people. He preached to his people for 950 years. We are told that he called his people using all his resources, day and night, in public and in private, but they still disbelieved and mocked all his efforts. He didn't give up and told them, "Seek your Lord's forgiveness, for He is truly most forgiving. He will shower you with abundant rain, supply you with wealth and children, and give you gardens as well as rivers." This promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is for us also. If a nation becomes obedient and asks for forgiveness, it is favored with every kind of blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Acting on this same instructions from the Quran, once during a famine, Hazrat Umar Razillah Ta'ala came out to pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for rain and begged only forgiveness of him. The people said, "O Commander of the Faithful, you have not prayed for the rain." He replied, "I have knocked at the doors of heaven, wherefrom the rain is sent down." And then he recited these verses of Surah Nuh to them. A main lesson of this surah is to note the efforts of Hazrat Nuh alayhi salam in spreading the message of Islam. Ask yourself, have I ever made an effort to spread Islam? Surah Jinn. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Jinn, which was revealed in the 10th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is that whoever has the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can benefit from the Quran, whether it is a man or a jinn. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 1, "Say, O Prophet, it has been revealed to me that a group of jinn listened to the Quran and said to their fellow jinn, 'Indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation.'" The last surah told us that Hazrat Nuh alayhi salam spent 950 years calling people to Islam and still they didn't believe. And here we are told that the jinn heard the Quran once and accepted the truth. We need to think, which category are we in? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 16, "And Allah revealed that if they had remained straight on the way, we would have given them abundant provision." We are taught that if the people were to remain steadfast on the right path, Allah would grant them blessings in this worldly life as well as the hereafter. Surah Al-Muzzammil. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Muzzammil, which was revealed in Makkah. According to the order of revelation, this surah is the third revelation. The central subject of this surah is a command to build a strong relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Tawheed. The beginning verses give instructions to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to stand up and worship, particularly at night, and recite the Quran with tartil. The tahajjud prayer is more effective in making us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it is a time when we are free from other obligations and commitments and we are able to concentrate more. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in verses 10 and 11, "Patiently endure what they say, ignore them politely, and leave to me those who deny the truth and live in luxury. Bear with me for a little while." The people who were actually denying Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and inciting the common people to oppose were the well-to-do people, because the reforming message of Islam was not in their interest. Surah Al-Muddaththir. Let's take a look at the flow chart chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Muddaththir, whose first 7 verses were in fact the second revelation. The surah instructs Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to invite people to Islam with advice and warning. The previous surah was about personal worship at night, and this surah is about the duties of a caller to Islam in daytime. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 2, "Arise and warn and proclaim the greatness of your Lord." In verses 11 to 26, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Walid bin Mughira, who was one of the biggest enemies of Islam at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had been blessed with wealth and a lot of sons, but he was still greedy. Due to his arrogance and plots against Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he himself will deal with him. The surah then mentions the 19 angels as keepers of hell, followed by the disbelievers' confession on the day of judgment, where they will say, "We were not of those who prayed, nor did we feed the poor, and we used to indulge in falsehood along with others and deny the day of judgment." Surah Al-Qiyamah. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Qiyamah, which was revealed in the 7th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is that the day of judgment is certain. In verse 2, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the nafs. What is nafs? Nafs literally means self and has been translated as psyche, ego, or soul. 3 adjectives have been used in the Quran to describe 3 different types of nafs. The first is nafsul ammara, the self that urges man to evil. Second type of nafs is known as nafsul lawama, the self that feels repentant at doing wrong, and the same is called conscience in modern terminology. The third is nafsul mutmainna, the self that feels satisfaction at following the right path and abandoning the wrong path. They are content with the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and doing good is what makes them happy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this surah swears by the second type of nafs that feels guilt. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that the whole point of putting this nafs inside us is so that we can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness at doing wrong. Next, in verses 16 to 19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes all the responsibility of the Quran, its revelation, preservation, collection, and explanation. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 20 to 21, "No, but you love the immediate and leave the hereafter." Our problem is that we want immediate results. We want the pleasures and comfort right now, knowing that now is the time for hard work and the hereafter is where we get the reward. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us in verse 36, "Does man think that he will be left alone, unquestioned?" Man thinks that he is not accountable for his deeds, but this is not true. Every one of us will have to answer for what we did. Surah Ad-Dahr. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Ad-Dahr, which was revealed in the first stage of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's stay in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is that man has got the freedom of choice between good and bad. The other name of this surah is Surah Al-Insan. The surah begins by reminding man of his humble beginnings. There was a time when he was nothing. Then he was developed and given the sense of hearing and seeing. He was given intelligence and shown both the ways, the path of gratitude as well as the path of ingratitude. Then he was put to test, and the test was to see which path he chose. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the pious people and the reward they will be given. One of the reasons why they will get the reward is mentioned in verse 9. When they donate food to the needy, they say, "We feed you only for the sake of Allah, seeking neither reward nor thanks from you." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 22, "And they will be told, all this is surely a reward for you. Your striving has been appreciated." Surah Al-Mursalat. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Mursalat, which was revealed in the first phase of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's stay in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is to believe in the day of judgment. The surah begins by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making 5 oaths. Then we are given a description of the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 15, "That will be a day of big loss for the deniers." This verse has been repeated 10 times in the Quran. Why? As a warning to us, like a loving mother, warning her kids over and over again of the consequences of their actions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that if we don't change our ways, we will be the biggest losers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verses 35 and 36, "On that day, they will not be in a position to speak, nor will they be permitted to offer excuses. All the proof will be there in front of our eyes, and our body parts will testify against us or for us." This brings us to the end of our lesson for today, and the question I'm going to ask myself. The question is, am I ready to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para. Allah Hafiz.